Hello everybody, and welcome back to Mistaken Truths. So, I'm sorry everyone for, again, taking so long to get this out there and get this done, but you know how life is and things like that. I don't think I'm going to go over this each and every time. I don't want it to be a regular thing, but it may or may not be, so I apologize again. But yeah, Animal Armageddon. So, one thing that I personally didn't expect, but something that was made apparent when I was watching this with the general community, you can check that out in the Discord down below, is it's awful. Like, that's something that's not the surprising part. It's just it's awful. Like, it looks terrible, the models are terrible, the animation is terrible. However, it's over dramatic, extremely over dramatic. However, when it comes to the actual, like, inaccuracies and accuracies, when you boggle down to it, it's actually not the worst. Like, I think that also has to do with the fact that they focus specifically on mass extinctions more than the animals themselves in those mass extinctions. They play a part, obviously. However, it isn't really something that's majorly focused on, and I think that it benefits from that, accuracy speaking. Like, I think the best way I can put it is that it is awful. It's still in the shit era after all, but it's not the worst. You could easily do a lot worse than Animal Armageddon. It's probably the best of the worst ones that I'm going to be covering. So, yeah, on that note, I think we can get started. First up, the Ordovician Extinction. So, this is one of the few where they sort of take like a very dramatic approach to the extinction itself, in terms of all the extinctions are overdramatic. Essentially all of them are. However, this is the one where where even like the cause of the extinction is wrong per se. So there is this theory out there that the Ordovician mass extinction was caused by a gamma ray burst, which is essentially when a massive swoon of energy from a supernova travels throughout the galaxy and the universe and all that, and ends up hitting a planet, and it can shred the atmosphere. It has a pretty devastating effect when it actually hits. However, you can't exactly, I don't want to say prove, but essentially that's the point. You can't exactly prove that a gamma ray burst hit the planet at some point. It's like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Like, for example, the KT asteroid makes sense because we physically found the crater. That is extraordinary evidence, as it were. But for this, there's not really anything significant that points towards a gamma ray burst. There's apparently some things, but not enough to warrant it being like a common solution. The most likely cause for the Ordovician Extinction event was something called a snowball Earth. So essentially what happens with that is, back during this time, there was no animals on land. None. So, there were no animals on land, right? However, there were primitive plants on land. Plants managed to get onto land first before animals did. Essentially what happened is that this lichen, as it were, colonized the land, right? And what exactly happened was they ended up continuing to populate because there's nothing on land to eat them. This is something, essentially with how photosynthesis works, they take in carbon dioxide, they release oxygen. Essentially more and more oxygen was getting to the atmosphere while there was less and less carbon dioxide. And what this resulted in was like this cooling fallout in temperature. The Earth's makeup just managed to receive the right conditions where it froze over and became a snowball Earth, essentially, which is what you can see in the top left here. And yeah, if you didn't notice as well, I tried to make this like a little bit more clean. This is something I should have mentioned in the beginning but forgot to. It's just I wanted to like make it like a little bit more presentable and professional, just along the lines of just so you guys have something to fall back on aside from my stuttering ass, right? So yeah, these are like all basic points. I'm going to be going into detail. Obviously I went over the actual details of Snowball Earth and the unlikeliness of the gamma ray burst, but these are things where if you just want to know it without the details, this is probably it. So yeah, outside the Ordovician Extinction, what else? The Eurypterids were gigantic. That is essentially the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, which are not actually related to scorpions. They're close relatives of the modern horseshoe crabs, and they'll play a big part later. So, essentially, the sea scorpions or Eurypterids in the documentary were gigantic. Like, this is the actual, like, comparison they put here. This is huge. If you look to the side here, looking at the model, this is most likely Megalograptus, I believe, would be the Eurypterid species here. However, they were relatively small. They're so big, they're not even in the top 5 in terms of large Eurypterids like we see here. We have Pterygotus here, and then there's the biggest one, Jackalopterus. And that guy was still only around 8 feet long, 2.5 meters. While this guy is at least 3 meters, maybe more. It looks gigantic. His pincers alone are like 2 meters. It is absurd. And there was also this moment in the documentary where there was essentially this point where Eurypterids were starting to dominate over like large nautiloids, which is purely speculative. I'm not gonna discuss that. They certainly didn't wipe out the giant nautiloids. At least I don't think so. The downfall of those cone nautiloids is more resulted more from jawed fishes and stuff like that, rather than any sort of mass extinction. However, as sea scorpions were dominating, they tried to give an example of how they became more adaptable by the Eurypterids dragging and hauling food onto land to eat, so they don't have to share it with fellow Eurypterids in the water. However, this isn't exactly true. As far as we know, Eurypterids were purely aquatic, aside from when they need to go on land to breed, just like modern horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs stay down in the deep sea for their entire lives, and then during the breeding season, they haul up onto the beach and get into these, like, I forgot the term for it. There's a specific term for those mass pilings of breeding horseshoe crabs, but Eurypterids did essentially the same thing, and that's when they went onto land. As far as I know, they didn't go onto land for any other reason. And then there was also 2 random things where I get that it's trying to be dramatic, but even this I couldn't excuse. So there was this moment where nautiloids dove into deeper water to avoid like the torrents of storms, and because of how their shell's structured, they couldn't take the pressure. So they basically exploded, which is not how pressure works. I understand that the concept of imploding and stuff, but even then, that doesn't really cause an explosion, does it? How the pressure deep sea works is that it crushes you from literally every single angle. I remember watching this one show where they took like a model of a human head and subjected it to similar pressures as in the deep sea, and they took it out and it technically didn't look damaged. It was just much, much, much smaller than it originally was. It was like they took a replica and shrunk it, and that's because it was forced from every direction so much that it essentially caused everything to compact densely in itself, which would kill any actual animal rather than an object. And there was also a scene where they talked about, like, to some extent, the glaciation. They didn't go over it as much as they should have, since even if one doesn't necessarily believe in the snowball Earth theory, then regardless, it still thinks that glaciation still played a role in the Ordovician extinction, and so that should have played a bigger part. The problem is how they depicted the glaciers. They depicted them like chasing nautiloids. It was actually insane. Glaciers do not move that fast at all. They're extremely gradual. The best speed I'd like to compare to glaciers is if you're looking at a clock and you're trying to see the moments where the hour hand on it actually moves. You can't see it because it's going by so slow, but you know it's moving because you check back on it every once in a while and it's clearly changed places. It's a similar thing here. The fastest glaciers known today only move around 5 to 6 feet an hour or so, I think. Don't quote me on this, but that if you think about it, that is actually kind of insane, but at the same time, that's not high-speed chase fast. You get the gist. That it's insane. So now moving on to the Devonian Extinction. So this one has more to do with the animals rather than the extinction itself. Most of these are like that. They get the general premise of the extinction, but they do not necessarily get the animals in them, as it were. So Dunkleosteus. First of all, Dunkleosteus is absolutely gigantic in this. It's around 9 meters long, I think. Which is what they originally thought Dunkleosteus was that size, but recently shrunk down to around 6 meters here. A lot smaller. And they also, this is also something that they tend to get wrong. It's the general range of where the animals lived. So Dunkleosteus, it's found in rocks in North America, Europe, and North Africa, I believe. I could be missing one or two places, and if so, I'm sorry, but I know they definitely are found there. However, they depicted Dunkleosteus living in Russia, or Siberia, rather. I think it's Siberia. I don't entirely remember, but that's not the point. It's somewhere in Asia, which relatives of Dunkleosteus have been found in Asia, but not Dunkleosteus itself. And then there's also Estenopteron. First of all, Estenopteron, it's not dramatically oversized, but it's still oversized regardless. I put this at around a little over 6 meters. Not 6 meters, 2 meters, 6 feet or so. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but it's definitely in the 2 meter range, while this one here is more along the lines of a little over a meter. A little over a meter, not that massive. And then there was also this place as well. Estenopteron is a Canadian species. It's only known from I believe Quebec, while it was depicted spawning in Italy, which incorrect as far as we know. And then there's Tiktaalik, which is slightly oversized. I'm pretty sure this is meant to say 1.7 meters rather than 2.7 meters. But yeah, it was relatively the same size as Estenopteron, maybe a little bit bigger. While in here it's depicted as being not only larger than Estenopteron, but also like nearly 3 meters or so. It's kind of ridiculous. And it was also displaced. Tiktaalik is only known from Greenland, while in Animal Armageddon it was depicted living in the UK. I don't know the whole England, Britain, UK debacle. I know there's like different orientations to each of them in that whole thing, but in order to be the most technically correct I can be, I'm gonna save myself and just say UK. Okay? Okay. So, finally is Ichthyostega, which is not only oversized itself, it was again about the same size as Tiktaalik and Estenopteron. It wasn't that big. This is around like 2.5 meters, maybe 3 meters. This is a big boy. Ichthyostega was not that large. And one thing that not a lot of people do not entirely know is that it was not really capable of walking in the same sense that modern salamanders and reptiles and amphibians do. Ichthyostega is not an amphibian. This is something that I don't entirely expect myself, looking at Ichthyostega, because it just looks like a big salamander. What's the problem? But Ichthyostega is not an amphibian, at least in the traditional sense. It is very much similar to Tiktaalik, and that is what's called a tetrapodomorph, which is essentially the transition between the regular fishies as well as the tetrapods, or first true amphibian-ish creatures. Ichthyostega was in that group. It had gills, it had the capability of breathing underwater, and it also could not properly walk. It had a fully developed pelvis, and it clearly has back legs. However, we don't think that it could properly walk in the same way that an amphibian or reptile could. It was still stuck sort of dragging itself along in the same vein that Tiktaalik did. Now we're getting onto the Cretaceous Extinction event. So again, KT, blah blah blah. But in the dinosaurs here are what suffered the most. So first we're going to be talking about Troodon, or Lateni venatrix, as it is now called. For those who do not know, Troodon was dubbed an invalid genus in 2017, and has since been split into 2 species. Lateni venatrix is the much more common of the two. Most of Troodon's remains are Lateni venatrix, while there are certain individuals in Dinosaur Park which have been rebranded into Stenonychosaurus. So for the sake of broadness, I'm going to be sticking on Lateni venatrix. It's got sort of the typical problems that a small theropod dinosaur would face. It has pronated hands. It had pronated hands as depicted taking down a hadrosaur. which is sort of insane. No Troodont was capable of taking care of that. In fact, I'm pretty sure no Dromaeosaur at that time could do that, but that is insane. And then there's also the complete lack of any sort of feathering, like this Latiniventrix here by Fred the Dinosaur Man here. Now on to T-Rex. Now, I have a hard time pointing specific details of what's wrong with the Animal Armageddon T-Rex, however you can clearly see by the two comparisons that it is a bit off. The proportions are a bit wacky, I'd say. It's got an oddly short tail. It's got a very, very boxy head and a shrink-wrapped skull. It's got pronated hands as well, and everything along those lines. And then this Quetzalcoatlus, the giant pterosaur. Now, in terms of general like body anatomy, it is not too bad. It does have the standard Aztec shape. It does not have the body shape of, like, say, a Pteranodon, for example, or Pteranodon, typical pterodactyloid pterosaur. Aztecs were very much structured differently because they were much more adapted to land than other pterosaurs were. However, it does lack pictofibers, which are one of the trademarks of pterosaurs, and it is also oversized. It was given they said 45 feet, which is around 13 meters or so, 13-14 meters, while in reality it was along the 10-meter wingspan range. It was a lot smaller than that. And now we're getting on to Mosasaurus, which is probably the worst done of all of the animals here. It is extremely shrink-wrapped, given a very eel-esque body, as well as its skull is extremely shrink-wrapped as well. You can literally see the skull if you look at a Mosasaur skull on that Mosasaur head. And then it also lacks the tail fluke that we now know Mosasaurs had. It is oversized as well. The pain is around 15 meters in length or so, while we know that that Mosasaurus, which we're assuming this is attributed to, it says Mosasaurus lived during the KT, so that's better for it. Mosasaurus is the largest of the Mosasaurs, and it was around 12 meters in length. It did not get as large as the one in Animal Armageddon. And finally, we've got Triceratops. Now, Triceratops is not oversized in the sense that it was scaled to be gigantic. That one was fine, I think. I go a little bit loose, so I don't pay attention to the very fine details. However, in terms of like the actual length, it appeared fine. It was just a matter of the weight. They put it at around 13 tons, which is absolutely insane. Triceratops was believed to have been around 8 tons or so, which is the same as T-Rex. And the largest ceratopsid, Eotriceratops, was only around 10 tons. 13 tons is massive. Like, even Shantungosaurus was only around 12 tons. That is absolutely massive for a ceratopsid. And they also paint the veins of it potentially being a bit over-social. They sort of compared it to other ceratopsid species where it probably lived in great herds like bison. However, there's a lot of skepticism about Triceratops in general following that social structure, because despite Triceratops being known from hundreds of specimens, many complete, actual like large groups of them are very rare. It's not like Centrosaurus or Chasmosaurus or anything along those lines where they're found in these great herds and are bringing in the dozens, potentially hundreds. Triceratops has not been found in any fashion like that, despite being one of the most well understood ceratopsids. So they're thinking that they were either solitary or lived in much smaller groups. That is very much something that is more theoretical. More theoretical in a sense, however, we're gonna go with it. Alright, so speaking of hadrosaurs, let's talk about Animal Armageddon's hadrosaur. It was just placed as a generic hadrosaur, although I think it's based on Edmontosaurus, hence why I put a more accurate reconstruction here. So, yeah, looking at it, it's not great, is it? You can tell just looking at it. It feels... This is how they use it in the documentary as well. They tend to sort of like, for some reason, paint hadrosaurs as like herbivorous theropods, where they're up on 2 legs all the time, and they got a similar sort of structure with a snake-like neck, as well as the more compact face. However, hadrosaurs were not like this. They were primarily quadrupedal, and I'm pretty sure facultative bipeds is the proper word, where they were mostly quadrupedal but could go bipedal whenever they really wanted to, similar to bears. And it also feels very shrink-wrapped, although looking at it, I'm not entirely sure exactly, like the proportions and the proportions and the like shrink rapidness on the body is kind of weird. I don't know exactly how to describe it, like with the T-Rex, but it just generally looks off. I wouldn't really look to this as an accurate hadrosaur, as it were. The documentary also had Protoceratops, which themselves looked okay. It's just that they really should have been extinct by now. Protoceratops lived 75 million years ago, or a good 10 million years before the KT even happened. And then we got Phobosukis, or as it was quoted in Animal Armageddon. Phobosukis as a name does not exist anymore. Phobosukis is now Deinosuchus, essentially. So once you realize it's Deinosuchus, you realize all the problems right off the bat. Like, this is an extremely narrow, sort of garruloid, false Gharial-esque skull. It feels, this guy looks very much more like a Sarcosuchus than any Deinosuchus ever is. While Deinosuchus was a very robust alligator like crocodilian. Phobosukis was also oversized. It was given as around 12 meters in length, when Deinosuchus was around 9 to 10 meters or so. It wasn't that big. Moving on from the Deinosuchus or Phobosukis. Oh, hang on. Well, I forgot one thing. Phobosukis should have also been extinct by this point. Deinosuchus lived at the same time as Protoceratops, 75 million years ago or so. So it would have been extinct by the time the KT extinction hit. And now properly moving on from Deinosuchus, we got the massive ammonites. So the ammonites themselves, they looked okay. They were given squid tentacles, which I think is a bit weird. You don't really see that on most members of cephalopods. That seems like something distinct to squids. But regardless, I'm just going to let it go. We don't really know anything about the soft parts of ammonites. However, they were gigantic. Like, this is an ammonite compared to a supposedly 15-meter long mosasaur. And you can see where I'm getting at. This thing is like the size of a car. It is huge. There were certain huge ammonites. Some that can get, like, if you put the shell on the ground, it'd be standing a good 2 meters high. There are certain ammonites which are huge. However, not that huge. That is excessive. And then you have a dinosaur that appeared very briefly. It wasn't mentioned much. It was sort of like an offhanded cameo. Was Bryonosaurus, which was a troodontid that in the documentary shared the same model as the troodon. You couldn't tell them apart if they didn't tell you. They very much have the same issues inherently, in that lack of feathers, pronated hands, should be extinct by now, so on. And then finally, to end off the Cretaceous extinction is Purgatorius itself. Now, all the documentaries do have this one underdog ancestor of humans that they follow throughout the show. Now, for the most part, most of them are fine, to be honest. Like, Tiktaalik did have a little bit of problems, and Purgatorius itself does have a problem. It looks okay, however, they for some reason painted it as like a scavenging burrower type, when as far as we know, Purgatorius was not like this. It was very much an arboreal creature. It was essentially like a squirrel, a Cretaceous squirrel. It was a basal primate, but it very much acted like a squirrel. Forget what I said about being the end of the KT extinction, we have just a little bit more. So they depicted this is the most generic sauropod shape I can think of. It's got a relatively short swooping tail, raised neck with a very box-like head, as well as very stout legs. This is not inherently wrong for a titanosaur, I think. However, this is literally the most generic sauropod shape one can think of, and that's the reason why I think that's the reason why I can't think of anything like seriously wrong with it, because at the end of the day they just chose a generic sauropod for their titanosaur, which is sort of odd. There are many unique and cool looking titanosaur shapes they could have gone with. There were some that were absolutely huge, there were smaller ones, there were armored ones, there were plain ones, and so on. And finally we got Velociraptor. Now, some of you might be confused why I have a picture of the Velociraptor from Dino D-Day as the Animal Armageddon Velociraptor, but that is because, if you pay attention, there's something that I did not realize until shortly before watching it, is they share the same model. Velociraptor from Dino D-Day is the same one as the one from Armageddon, which is absolutely insane to me. But regardless, it suffers from essentially the same problems as the Troodon Bryonosaurus. It very much lacks most feathers, although it has some on it. It's got some in its arms, tail, and the top of the head. However, it should be completely covered in feathers, as well as having wings on its arms. The Velociraptors were also, I don't believe they were entirely pronated, during the documentary, but they did have it at some points, so that is something that is inaccurate about them. Next up, we got the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, the Great Dying, the Big Die, whatever you want to call it. So the creatures themselves, for the most part, were actually okay, outside of, like, bad quality models and animation. But first of all, let's start with the Gorgonopsid, which is easily the worst of the bunch. It is depicted as essentially this weird, scraggly, hairless dog, I think, is the best way to describe it. It's got this very boxed, shrink-wrapped head, compact body, long tail, and really long legs. However, Gorgonopsids were a bit more sleek than that, as it were. You can see here. This one has quite a bit more rectangular head. Its head is a lot more rectangular, obviously less shrink-wrapped than the Armageddon one. It had a longer, more... it's definitely not weasel-like, but it definitely wasn't as compact as this. As well as having a bit more shorter, stout legs. The Gorgonopsid isn't the only one of the problems either. You also have Dicynodon here, which I think was a non-inclusion considering they already included Lishosaurus, but I guess they wanted a similar species that died off while another one survived. I don't know. But regardless, it is a lot worse in accuracy speaking than the Lishosaurus is. It's okay in terms of general body shape, however the head seems very, very odd. They gave it a visible keratinous beak, which, as well as a very box-like head that sort of like dangles away from the rest of the body. It's almost like a bobblehead. It is very, very weird. And then finally you also got sort of like displaced creatures, or ones that were shown in areas where they really shouldn't be. Lishosaurus, Dicynodon, Gorgonopsid, and Thernaxodon were all depicted in North America, when as far as we know they did not live in North America. All four of those species are known pretty much exclusively from South Africa, although Lishosaurus is known very much from other parts of the world like Antarctica and Asia. Dicynodon was later on depicted in Asia, however it only lived in South Africa. Now moving on to the Triassic Extinction then. Out of all the extinction events, well, proper extinction events, you'll see why I said that in a little bit. Out of all the proper extinction events that they showed off, this was probably the least traumatic one. The Triassic Extinction was a result of Pangea finally splitting apart into the two major landmasses that make up a majority of the Mesozoic, and only really started to form the proper continents in the Cretaceous. But essentially, because of the Pangea splitting apart, it started two things. One, it kickstarted a lot of volcanic activity from the breaking apart of the one big landmass. However, there was also the fact that essentially because a brand new ocean was formed, it essentially caused worldwide climate change, which caused a lot of creatures to die off and so forth. The documentary painted it as sort of like this apocalypse. Well, they essentially paint all of them as apocalypses, but this one in particular really was not warranted. It was much more of a gradual change than that. And speaking of which, something I forgot to mention during the Cretaceous Extinction event, is they painted the extinction event happening and the last dinosaurs dying out as only all of it happening in only a 1 year period, when that was probably not true. It probably took hundreds, maybe thousands of years, or maybe a decade at least. However, I highly doubt it took like a year or so for all of them to die. That seems like a bit excessive. As for the rest of the Triassic wildlife, you have Eudimorphodon, which has a little bit more issues than the Quetzalcoatlus did. It not only lacks pectinofibers, but is also quite shrink-wrapped. You can see it on the model here compared to this reconstruction I found. And Eudimorphodon was also depicted being a species that lived worldwide, essentially traveling the globe, when in reality Eudimorphodon was only found in Italy, as far as I know. They also depicted Desmatosuchus as completely lacking predators, when in reality I'm pretty sure with that armor it probably had some that needed to defend itself against. Like here it is shown fending itself off against Pososuchus, for example, a raw-suced crocodile-like animal. And then there's also Styracosaurus, which was a very odd choice for this documentary, because not only was Styracosaurus extinct by the time that this extinction event happened, Desmatosuchus was also extinct by this point as well. Not only Styracosaurus should have been extinct by now, it only lived during the start of the late Triassic. It didn't get all the way to the end towards the extinction event. However, it also did not live in North America, which it was depicted in. It lived down in South America, which is where most of the early dinosaurs were found. And finally, probably the biggest one, Styracosaurus, as well as all Herrerasaurs, like Herrerasaurus and Chilesaurus, they all did not survive the Triassic Extinction. Dinosaurs in general survived, but Herrerasaurs did not. The Jurassic Extinction event did kill them off. So, I don't know why they chose Styracosaurus in particular. They could have chose Coelophysis and it would have fit in perfectly, but what do I know? It is also in terms of as far as dinosaur models go, this one is pretty alright. However, it again suffers from the shrink wrap skull. The skull also has a somewhat different shape. It is a bit more high and sloped than the actual Styracosaurus skull is, and it also has the typical pronated hands that is incorrect with all the theropods in this show. Going on to the second part of the Triassic Extinction event, one of the things that they tried to make note of in terms of the dinosaur success was their bipedalism, which was sort of a common mindset among paleontologists at the time as to why dinosaurs became so successful. However, it is now thought this isn't really the case because there were many different groups of reptiles at that time that evolved bipedalism independently, something called convergent evolution, when groups of animals are not related to each other but they still develop similar features anyway. For example, Postosuchus, a Rawsuchian, and one of the top predators at the time, was in fact bipedal. Down here is a cousin of Postosuchus and all Rawsuchians, the Ornithosuchus, as well as this odd creature down here, Ephigia. They are all unrelated animals that all develop bipedalism independently. I'm not entirely sure about these two. These two are pretty closely related, so they might... So I don't know if they convergently evolve bipedalism. But regardless, you still got all these different groups that were bipedal and lived during the same time as the dinosaurs. You also had Megazostrodon, which was the underdog human ancestor during this episode. They depicted living in North America, when in reality it actually lived in South Africa. And finally, at the end, they tried to say that the modern continents formed during the KT extinction. Oh, not the KT, the Triassic Extinction, my mistake. However, this is not the case. The Triassic and Jurassic Extinction caused Pangaea to break apart into the two main landmasses that would stay there for the majority of the for the Mesozoic and not form into the proper continents. I forgot what the northern one is called. I think it's Laurasia, but don't quote me on that. And then there's also certainly Gondwana. Those were the two main continents that the dinosaurs lived on for the majority of the Mesozoic. The continents began to properly form into a recognizable shape, at least, by the Cretaceous. However, for the most part, that is how the Earth looked at that time. Now we're going on to the final episode, or the final relevant episode. The final episode of Animal Armageddon tried to speculate about what would happen if an asteroid, the equivalent of the KT, hit Earth today. However, that is irrelevant to me. I'm only focusing on the prehistoric stuff. So for now, this is the last one. So they focused on the Toba Eruption, which is quite odd considering the Ice Age has its own proper mass extinction and has own proper mass extinction in the events of potentially both climate change and extinction via humans. However, they for some reason chose the Toba Eruption 70,000 years ago, which was believed to have been the largest eruption known to science at this point. The largest eruption known to science. There could have easily been bigger ones. However, this is the only one. This is the largest one that we know of. However, it was not a mass extinction. Even the documentary describes the effects of it being felt for thousands and thousands of years onward and being a mass extinction level worthy. However, the actual results of the Toba eruption, at worst, would have lasted about a decade or so, which does not sound all that dramatic, is it? And there's evidence that points towards the Toba eruption not being even as dramatic as people once thought, considering that African rock beds at the time didn't show any different effects around the time, suggesting that it didn't even reach that far past Sumatra, where the volcano erupted. But moving on from them onto the animals, we got Elasmotherium, which was shown in our rainforest. An Ice Age rhino that lived in Siberia and other cold tundras was shown in the rainforest, which is pretty insulting if I do say so myself. They also painted as an ancestor of modern rhinos, which is not true. As far as we know, modern rhinos were either around or still evolving around this time in Africa and Southeast Asia and different places like that. They also had Gigantopithecus, which should have been extinct by this point. Gigantopithecus became extinct around 300,000 years ago, when the Toba Eruption happened only around 70,000 years ago. They also had Sumatran leopards and Asiatic pumas, which don't really exist. If there is evidence of them, either they're extremely obscure, or I just do not know it. They also showed Stegodon, Elasmotherium, and the cave lion becoming extinct around the time of the Toba Eruption. However, this is not correct. All of them became extinct much later than that. They were not killed off by the Toba Eruption. And now, speaking of the cave lions, they were also shown in a pretty bad light. They were shown having stripes, which was due to a belief at the time that they could have potentially had stripes or have been more related to tigers and lions. However, this has been debunked as far as I know. And they were shown living in southern Asia in the rainforests, which is not correct. They lived in the northern parts of Eurasia, northern Europe, Siberia, and even Alaska and the Yukon. They very much preferred colder environments, while the modern lion, as far as we know, stick to the hotter, more tropical climes. And finally, the manes. There is a bit of debate on whether or not cave lions actually had manes or had fully developed manes. However, even if we just disregard that whole debate, it was a bit dramatic on the animal Armageddon lines. Like, whereas I'm assuming this is a family, you got male, female, baby, and all of them have manes. Even the baby has a mane. That is a bit excessive, don't you think? And yeah, I already went over this. The Toba Eruption lasted like a decade at most, not 5,000 years, as was painted in the documentary. They tried to claim that the Toba Eruption sort of like kick-starting a cooling event in the glacial periods that came and went as Earth went. They tried to say that woolly mammoths appeared during this time, which is not correct. They appeared like a good several tens of thousands of years before the Toba Eruption. They also tried to say that humans were less adaptable because of modern technology. However, that is not really true, considering many humans today still very much, like especially in third world countries, do not have all this intense technology that first world society does. And there's also the fact that I think giving humans a lot less credit than they should have, which I'm not even going to go over why. That just seems a bit much and something odd to go on, but I guess that was sort of something to sort of like kickstart into the final episode they have. Alright, so we've reached the end, and I'd like to say thank you for watching, guys. I am so sorry if I went a bit quick, or if I missed some things. My notes on these my note game was weak during watching these, so I greatly apologize if I missed anything, or if I'm not clear. I'm not entirely sure. Just let me know what you guys think in the comments, guys. Sorry it took so long. But yeah, next time we'll be focusing on the Clash of the Dinosaurs series, which I believe is a 4-part documentary along with the Last Days of the Dinosaurs movie documentary. I'm not entirely sure, but regardless, that's what we're covering next time. And I'll warn you guys now, it is the worst of the worst, and I'll explain why during that episode. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.